Breakers Point wasn't the kind of place you stumbled onto by accident. Locals knew it was dangerous. A stretch of unforgiving shoreline just south of Penobscot Bay, Maine. Steep cliffs, hidden tide pools, and a fog that rolled in quick enough to blind a man mid-step. For experienced fishermen, though, it was worth the risk. The water around the point was rich with striped bass and mackerel, and Daniel Mercer knew those tides better than most. He'd fished there since high school. He liked the solitude, the cold, the silence. It was the only place he said his thoughts didn't crowd him. On the morning of September 8, 2018, he packed his gear, kissed his daughter's head as she finished her cereal, and told his wife he'd be back before sunset. He never came home. Daniel was 42, married 17 years, a quiet man. Never loud in crowds, not the type to drink or disappear. He'd been laid off from a lobster processing plant the year before, but he picked up seasonal work and kept the house running. Fishing was his outlet. It wasn't unusual for him to go alone. But this trip was different. There was no storm forecast, no warning signs. He left at 5:15 a.m., headed out in his beat-up silver Tacoma with his tackle box, rod, thermos, and the same windbreaker he wore every year once fall crept in. He waved to the old man who ran the bait shop off Route 3 and bought frozen herring and squid strips. Nothing strange. Nothing off. By 8 a.m., a couple hiking the Breakers Point Trail passed his truck parked by the gravel overlook. They didn't see him, didn't think much of it. The tide was out and the rocks below were slick and glistening. Later, a weather buoy offshore would record an unusually steep pressure drop around 9:20, followed by a short burst of dense fog. Locals would say it wasn't that uncommon for September, but no one saw Daniel after that. No phone call, no messages, no sign he ever left the shore. At 6:43 p.m., his wife Leanne called his phone for the 5th time. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. That was the last time the line ever connected. At 7:10, she called the police. When they arrived just before nightfall, Daniel's truck was still there, locked, windows fogged from the cool air. Inside were his keys, wallet, a half-eaten granola bar, and a small leather journal he kept notes in. Tide patterns, catch counts, weather details. His tackle box was set down neatly near a mossy outcrop just 20 yards down the bluff, positioned like someone had taken their time setting up. His rod was missing. So was his phone. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no indication of a fall. Just nothing. The tide was coming in fast by then, erasing any footprints on the lower rocks. Whatever had happened, if anything had, was already being swallowed by the sea. By midnight, search and rescue had been activated. Boats ran spotlights along the shoreline. A chopper circled overhead until fuel ran dry. But visibility was low, and that coastline didn't forgive mistakes. The next morning, divers were sent to check the submerged tide pools. They found jellyfish, seaweed, broken shells. No body, no equipment, no trace. For the first 48 hours, no theory was off the table. The possibility of an accidental fall remained the lead theory. But with no broken railing, no scraped rocks, no signs of impact or drag, even that started to feel thin. A suicide didn't fit. Daniel had no history of depression, no notes, no sudden changes. His wife described him as calm but engaged. His daughter said he promised to take her to a movie that weekend. He'd made plans, paid bills, bought groceries. Everything about his life showed intention, not escape. Friends and neighbors were brought in for questioning. Leanne's phone records were pulled. Search dogs swept the cliffs and woods for 3 days straight. But the only scent they picked up led from his truck to the edge of the trail and vanished at the rock line. One of the dogs froze at the bluff's edge and refused to move for over a minute. Handlers couldn't explain it. As the week wore on, media coverage began to pick up. Fisherman vanishes without a trace. Ghost at Breakers Point. The usual speculation started. Some said he slipped and was carried out with the tide. Others whispered about drug debts, fugitives, even cults in the woods. But none of those stuck. There was no money missing, no signs of secrets. Daniel Mercer had simply gone. By the end of the second week, hope started to fade. Leanne stood on the cliff's edge at sunset every night, waiting for something, anything, to float back in. But the ocean gave nothing. Search efforts were scaled back. The case shifted from rescue to recovery. And by the time the first frost hit in October, Daniel's name had become another cold file in a small town used to silence. Still, no one could quite shake the feeling that he hadn't simply slipped, that something else happened out there. Something no one saw. Because when a man that careful disappears without a sound, the question isn't just where he went, it's who else was there. When the first full day passed without Daniel, the search shifted from a worried family effort to an all-out operation. Breakers Point was sealed off at dawn. Uniformed officers lined the trailhead, their radios crackling, while local volunteers in reflective vests fanned out with search dogs. The tide was out again, exposing slick rock channels and seaweed-coated ledges. From above, it looked like a broken jaw of stone biting into the Atlantic. The working assumption was simple. Daniel had slipped. If he had, his body should have been caught in one of the tide pools or dragged into a cove. But the rocks were clean. Not a streak of blood, not a piece of torn clothing, not even a bent fishing hook to suggest a struggle. Helicopters swept offshore in slow arcs, their spotlights cutting across gray waves. The Coast Guard deployed 2 boats, scanning for anything that might have surfaced. Experienced divers went down into crevices between the rocks. They expected to find at least a fragment, a broken line, a tackle box, even his thermos. Instead, the water gave them nothing. His fishing rod was missing. His phone was missing. It was as if Daniel had carried them both into thin air. The absence itself began to feel louder than any discovery could. Searchers moved inland next. If he had wandered from the cliffs, maybe disoriented by fog, maybe injured, then the woods might still hold him. Grid patterns were mapped out, and volunteers carried whistles, calling his name every 100 yards. But the forest remained silent. No branches broken, no footprints beyond the ones his boots had left on the cliff trail days before. A heat-sensing drone was flown in during the second night. It picked up deer, raccoons, and one lone coyote. Not Daniel. By the third day, questions were shifting from, how did he fall, to did he fall at all? Some of the locals began murmuring that Daniel might have walked away on purpose, but Leanne shut that down hard. She stood at the command tent with her daughter clinging to her side and told the reporters flat out he would never leave her. She repeated it again, quieter, to the officers who were taking her statement. She believed every word. Still, theories began to fracture. Accidental drowning remained the official narrative, the simplest explanation, even if it didn't line up neatly with the evidence. Others speculated suicide. But Daniel's family pushed back. His daughter's birthday was coming up, and he had already bought her a fishing pole of her own. There was no debt, no sudden behavior changes, nothing that matched. That theory faded quickly. Foul play became the last option no one wanted to say out loud. Had he met someone at the point? Was another fisherman there that morning? A few claimed they'd seen a boat further offshore around the time Daniel disappeared, but no one could identify it, and no records showed anyone licensed to fish that cove that day. The Coast Guard logged dozens of vessels up and down the bay, but none tied directly to Breakers Point. The missing phone complicated everything. Investigators believed that if Daniel had slipped into the water, it should have washed ashore nearby within days. Phones didn't just vanish with no trace. The fact that it was never recovered made detectives suspect it was taken, not lost. They issued a ping request to the carrier, but the last signal was 7:13 a.m. that morning, near the point itself. After that, nothing. Either it died on the spot, or it was destroyed. The family's grief became tangled with the silence of the investigation. Leanne returned to the overlook every morning, staring out over the water, refusing to leave until dark. Her daughter stopped asking when he was coming home and began asking instead if he had been scared. Police encouraged Leanne to stay away while searches were ongoing, but she ignored them. Each evening, she lingered until officers gently escorted her back to her car. As days stretched into a week, the tone of the community shifted. At the diner, patrons whispered over their coffee cups. Some thought Daniel had debts, that the quiet man everyone thought they knew might have been running from something. Others believed he'd been taken. Fishermen began refusing to cast lines at Breakers Point, saying it felt wrong, like the ocean was keeping something. Rumors spread faster than facts, and soon everyone had their own version of what happened. The police tried to steady the narrative. They released a statement. There is no evidence of foul play at this time. Search operations are ongoing. We ask the public not to speculate. But speculation was all anyone had. By the end of the second week, helicopters were pulled back and Coast Guard resources shifted elsewhere. What remained was a scaled-down local search team walking the cliffs with binoculars, staring at the sea that never stopped moving. The official language was suspended pending new leads. The unofficial feeling was worse. It felt as though Daniel Mercer had simply been erased, and still there were no witnesses, not a splash heard, not a cry for help, not a trace of him on the rocks where he supposedly fell. The silence became its own evidence. And in that silence, the question began to grow heavier with each passing day. If Daniel didn't fall into the ocean, then where had he gone? When investigators processed Daniel's truck, most of what they found painted the picture of a man who had intended to come back. His wallet, his license, the receipt from the bait shop time-stamped at 5:47 a.m., all of it suggested routine. But tucked beneath the driver's seat was something no one expected. A small, leather-bound notebook, scuffed at the corners, pages swollen slightly from years of damp air. It was Daniel's fishing journal. Leanne told detectives he had kept it since his 20s. It wasn't a diary in the usual sense. He wasn't a man who confessed feelings on paper. Instead, the book was a collection of tide charts sketched in his careful handwriting, water temperatures, moon phases, and notes on where the bass ran thickest each season. He'd log what bait he used, how long he cast, even how the fog behaved on different mornings. To an outsider, it read like data. To Daniel, it was ritual. But in between the clinical notes, there were quieter fragments, lines written in the margins that slipped from observation into reflection. Things like, "Morning fog rolled in early, makes me feel like I'm the last person alive." Or, "The sea has moods. Today it felt like it wanted me gone." They weren't confessions so much as thoughts he never said out loud. Leanne admitted she hadn't read it in years. She thought of it as his private space, and when police handed it back to her in an evidence bag, she cried, not because it was a clue, but because it was the most personal object they'd recovered since he disappeared. One detail unsettled investigators immediately. The final entry was dated September 7th, the day before he vanished. It started like all the others, a note about the pressure system, water clarity, a prediction about the next tide, but the last line trailed off. "Tomorrow I'll try the point near the split rock if," and then nothing, just a dash across the paper, as if he'd been interrupted mid-sentence and never returned to finish it. At first, detectives chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe he'd gotten distracted, maybe he planned to fill it in later. But when the crime lab processed the book for prints, something strange surfaced. Alongside Daniel's fingerprints smudged in the corner of that last page was a partial that didn't belong to him. The ridge pattern was faint but clear enough to confirm it belonged to someone else. The lab ran it through the automated fingerprint identification system. No match. They tried again, cross-referencing state and federal databases. Nothing. It didn't belong to any known criminal, any registered worker, or anyone in the law enforcement system. It simply floated there, attached to no one, on the very page where Daniel's writing stopped short. When investigators questioned Leanne, she swore she had never touched the book. She hadn't opened it in years. Daniel's daughter was too young at the time to have left a print that size. Detectives asked about friends, fishing partners, anyone who might have borrowed it. Leanne shook her head. The journal was the one thing Daniel never shared. The discovery shifted the tone of the investigation. Until then, everything pointed toward an accident, the sea swallowing a man whole. But the fingerprints suggested proximity. Someone had been close enough to handle his most private possession, close enough to leave a mark. It planted a darker possibility, that Daniel hadn't been alone that morning. Theories began to circulate inside the department. Maybe he'd met someone at the cliffs. Maybe he'd handed them the book. Or maybe it had been taken from him. Without context, the partial print was more haunting than helpful. Detectives quietly held it back from the press. They told the public the journal was recovered, but not what it contained. To Leanne, they admitted it raised suspicions of foul play, but with no name attached, it was little more than a shadow. Among locals, rumors grew. At the bar, men whispered about strangers seen on the trail that week. One claimed he'd noticed an unfamiliar pickup parked near the overlook 2 mornings in a row before Daniel vanished, though he couldn't recall the plates. Another swore he'd heard 2 voices echoing in the fog around the time Daniel usually arrived. None of it was verifiable. None of it could be tied back to the partial print. The journal was logged into evidence, sealed in a box, but it kept resurfacing in case briefings. It was the only physical clue that hinted at another person. Detectives revisited it every time the case seemed to stall. Who had touched it, and why? Why was the final entry left unfinished? For Leanne, it became a painful obsession. She reread the last page over and over, tracing the interrupted line with her finger, wondering what Daniel had meant to write. She admitted to her sister that she sometimes dreamt of him sitting at the wheel of his truck, pausing mid-sentence because someone was standing outside the window. She would wake up certain he hadn't been alone that day, that somebody else had been waiting for him at Breaker's Point. And while police couldn't prove it, that was the first moment the official file began to tilt. What started as an accident on a cliff became something else, a case that carried the smell of another presence. The problem was, the fingerprint belonged to no one, which meant if there was another person out there, they were still a ghost, and ghosts didn't leave trails. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation into Daniel Mercer's disappearance began to split along painful lines. At first, the family and police had moved in step, united by urgency and fear. But once the helicopters left and the divers stopped sweeping the coves, cracks began to show. For Leanne, every hour without progress was proof the system had already given up. She accused detectives of treating her husband like another statistic, a man swept away by the sea, case closed. But she wasn't convinced. She told anyone who would listen that Daniel hadn't just vanished into the water. Somebody had been there. Somebody had touched his journal. And until police found out who, she wouldn't accept their silence. Her frustration grew into open hostility. She refused to sign consent forms for releasing Daniel's medical records, insisting they weren't relevant. She stopped returning calls from the lead detective and began speaking directly to reporters instead, holding small press gatherings in front of her house. With her daughter at her side, she stood before cameras and accused the police of laziness, of ignoring leads, of refusing to treat the case as suspicious. Behind the scenes, investigators whispered that her grief was blinding her judgment, that she was pushing the case into conspiracy. But no one could deny the pressure her words stirred up in the community. Then, Mason Mercer came back. Daniel's younger brother hadn't been in town for years. He and Daniel had been estranged since their father's death, their relationship frayed by old resentment and debts Mason never repaid. His sudden arrival was met with mixed feelings. Some welcomed him as a concerned relative. Others muttered that trouble followed wherever Mason went. He was blunt from the start. Standing in Leanne's kitchen, surrounded by old photographs of his brother, Mason told detectives they were barking up the wrong tree. Daniel hadn't been a loner, he said. He'd made enemies. Mason claimed that years earlier, Daniel had worked a season on a private fishing boat crew out of Rockland, not a legal operation, but one that skirted licensing, tax, and regulation. According to Mason, the men who ran it were the kind who remembered debts long after they were paid. He suggested that Daniel owed money, or maybe he'd crossed them somehow. When pressed for names, Mason hesitated, then scribbled down 3 on a napkin. They were locals, known to police but not formally tied to violence. Investigators followed the lead. They tracked down the crew, 2 men in their late 40s, one in his 50s, all still living along the bay. Interviews were tense. Each admitted they'd worked with Daniel years ago, but claimed they hadn't seen him since. They brushed off Mason's allegations as old family drama. One even laughed when detectives mentioned the journal and the fingerprint, saying Daniel had always been too serious for his own good. But their dismissals weren't clean. Their timelines were shaky. One couldn't remember where he'd been the morning Daniel disappeared. Another admitted he'd been out on the water that week but claimed it was unrelated. Police logged the conversations but lacked evidence to dig deeper. Without a body, without proof of contact, all they had were suspicions. Still, the lead detective noted in his report that the men seemed nervous, careful in a way that suggested they were hiding something. Not necessarily murder, but something they didn't want dragged into the open. When those notes surfaced later, they would feed years of speculation. Back at home, the tension between Leanne and Mason grew. At first she welcomed him, grateful for his energy, his refusal to accept the lost at sea explanation. But soon his presence became disruptive. He drank heavily, crashed on her couch, and started telling neighbors Daniel's death was a setup. He told anyone who'd listen that the journal proved someone had been there, and that the crew Daniel once worked for had finally caught up with him. Leanne begged him to keep quiet, to stop feeding rumors, but Mason only grew louder. The Mercer household became divided, Leanne clinging to official channels, Mason stirring whispers of conspiracy. The investigators saw it too. They noted how Mason inserted himself at every turn, volunteering information, steering conversations toward his theory about the fishing crew. Some detectives began to suspect he was trying too hard, deflecting too fast. Others thought he was simply desperate to find meaning in his brother's absence. Either way, his reappearance shifted the focus from Daniel's life to the Mercer family itself. By the end of the fourth week, the case had grown murky. Leanne felt abandoned by police, ignored in her pleas. Mason believed shadows from Daniel's past had resurfaced, and he made sure the whole town knew it. The crew's alibis held, barely, but not strong enough to clear them completely. And the partial fingerprint on the journal remained unresolved, a small but haunting reminder that someone besides Daniel had left a mark on the last page of his life. The deeper detectives looked, the less clear the picture became. What had started as a simple missing persons case was now tangled in family bitterness, old debts, and unprovable suspicions. And beneath it all lingered the same hollow truth. There was still no body, no answers, and no certainty about what had really happened on those rocks at Breaker's Point. By the time November rolled in, the search for Daniel Mercer had slowed to a crawl. The official line was that resources were exhausted, but the truth was simpler. There was nothing left to find. No body, no rod, no phone, no trace of him on land or sea. What began as a desperate rescue had hardened into an unsolvable file, another cold entry in the drawer of missing men swallowed by the coast. For the people of the small town along Penobscot Bay, Breaker's Point transformed from a fishing ground into a place no one wanted to speak about. The nickname came first, the Dead Waters. It spread through bait shops, diners, and whispered warnings to newcomers. Parents told their children not to hike too close to the rocks. Fishermen quietly shifted to other coves, calling it superstition, but avoiding the point all the same. In a town that lived and breathed by the sea, places like Breaker's Point carried weight. Its silence now carried something heavier than waves. Stories began to fill the void that evidence left behind. One young fisherman claimed that 2 weeks after Daniel vanished, he was out casting nets at dawn when a dense wall of fog rolled in. He swore he heard a scream drift out from the cliffs, sharp, short, and swallowed almost immediately by the wind. When he reported it to police, officers checked the overlook and shoreline. They found nothing but gulls wheeling in the gray sky. Another man, an older lobsterman, said he saw the glow of a lantern moving along the rocks at night weeks later, bobbing up and down as if someone were searching. By the time officers responded, the fog was gone and the rocks were empty. Police wrote these accounts down but quietly dismissed them. No photographs, no footage, no corroborating witnesses. And yet the stories lingered. In small towns, whispers carried their own power, and soon Breaker's Point had become a ghost zone in the local imagination. The more time passed, the more the community filled the silence with their own versions of events. Some swore Daniel's brother Mason was right, that men from his past had come back to collect a debt. Others said the sea itself was cursed, that Daniel had become one of many who'd been taken by the tides. A few believed Leanne knew more than she admitted, pointing to her hostility toward police as suspicious. None of it led anywhere, but it gave the town something to hold on to, something more tangible than a void. Detectives, for their part, kept revisiting the same evidence, the journal, the partial fingerprint, the missing phone. Every path circled back to the same dead end. The journal was too vague, the print too partial, the phone unrecoverable. Leads that once seemed urgent faded into irrelevance. With no witness, no body, and no cause of death, the file could not move forward. Meanwhile, Leanne's grief hardened into ritual. Every weekend she drove to the cliffs with her daughter, leaving flowers or a folded note at the overlook. She began refusing interviews, shutting her blinds when reporters knocked, and eventually stopped speaking to Mason entirely. Their feud became town gossip. Some said Mason only made things worse, chasing old grudges instead of mourning. Others thought he was the only one brave enough to say what everyone feared. Daniel hadn't been alone that morning. Months passed this way. Winter storms battered the coast, and with each crashing wave, any evidence that might have remained was washed further out to sea. When spring came, Breakers Point was quieter than ever. Fishermen stayed away. Teenagers dared each other to walk the cliffs at night, but rarely lasted long. The air there seemed heavier, as if the place itself remembered what happened. For law enforcement, the case reached the point of stasis that investigators dread. Too little evidence to close, too few leads to advance. Files were boxed, reports stacked, and the Mercer disappearance was filed under pending. Detectives told Leanne the truth no one wanted to say aloud. Unless the ocean gave back a body, Daniel might never be found. Still, the sightings continued. More fishermen claimed to see odd lights in the fog. A hiker reported hearing footsteps behind him on a trail that ended at the cliffs, only to turn and find nothing. Each time, officers investigated. Each time, they left with nothing to show. The cliffside remained empty except for the sound of waves and wind. In the end, Breakers Point became less a place on a map and more a boundary in the town's mind. A line people refused to cross, a reminder that a man had vanished in broad daylight with no splash, no witness, and no return. What once was a fishing ground had become a legend whispered over coffee, a place marked not by nets and rods but by absence. And for Leanne, every new rumor cut deeper, because legends kept a story alive, but they never brought a man home. 5 years is a long time to live without answers, but for Leanne Mercer, it never felt like distance. It felt like waiting. When the calendar crossed into September each year, her chest tightened the same way it had the first night Daniel didn't come home. People told her time healed, but that wasn't true. Time just shifted the wound around, made it part of the routine. Life had to continue, meals cooked, bills paid, her daughter raised, and eventually she remarried. Friends saw it as a sign of healing. To Leanne, it was survival, but she never changed her phone number, never moved from the house she and Daniel had shared. And in the attic, in a sealed cardboard box, she kept his tackle gear exactly as he left it, hooks rusting, the old thermos tucked beside the reels, a shrine no one else was allowed to touch. Her daughter, Emily, grew into a teenager shadowed by a father-shaped absence. She carried her grief in dreams. Night after night, she woke gasping, saying she saw someone dragged into the sea by hands made of water. At first, Leanne thought it was just the child's way of processing loss, but as Emily grew, the dreams didn't fade. If anything, they became sharper. She described the rocks, the fog, the sound of waves pulling something heavy under. Sometimes she refused to go near the coast at all. Other times she begged her mother to take her there, saying she felt closer to him that way. Leanne never stopped her own rituals. Every September, without fail, she walked the cliffs of Breakers Point. She started when the first year ended without answers, and she never missed it after. She didn't tell her new husband when she went. It wasn't something he could share. It wasn't for him. It was for Daniel. Some years she brought flowers, other years only silence, but always she stood on the overlook until her legs ached, staring down at the rocks and water that had kept their secrets. By the fall of 2023, the weather forecasts had grown dire. Meteorologists warned of one of the worst nor'easters in a decade, a storm system swelling fast over the Atlantic and expected to slam the coast with brutal winds, heavy rain, and flooding tides. Authorities urged residents to stay inland. Breakers Point was specifically listed as dangerous, with police barriers erected to block the trailhead. But for Leanne, the warnings didn't matter. The anniversary fell just days before the storm was due to make landfall. She went anyway. That morning the air was thick, electric with the charge of oncoming weather. Clouds gathered like bruises over the water. The wind carried a whistle, low and constant, pressing against her ears as she walked the trail alone. At the overlook, the ocean looked meaner than she'd ever seen it, waves pounding harder than memory allowed. She braced herself against the railing and felt the cold spray hit her face. For an hour she stood there, thinking of the man who had once filled that silence with the flick of his reel and the steady patience of waiting for a catch. It was when she finally turned to leave that she saw it. Down below, near the waterline where seaweed tangled against stone, something pale glinted between the crash of waves. At first she thought it was driftwood, or maybe a plastic bag caught on rock. But when the water pulled back for a brief second, she caught the outline more clearly, a shape wrapped in something dark, half hidden beneath kelp. Her heart clenched, every instinct screaming that it didn't belong there. She scrambled back along the trail, dialing emergency services as she moved, her voice breaking as she told dispatch there was something on the rocks, something the tide had dragged in. By the time police arrived, the weather had turned worse. Rain sheeted sideways, the waves surging higher, making access to the lower ledges nearly impossible. But the officers saw it too. Tangled in the surf, lodged in crevices, was a waterproof duffel, battered by years of salt and storm. Rescue teams managed to pull it free just as the tide threatened to carry it back out. It was heavy, waterlogged, but intact. When they dragged it onto the overlook and unzipped the outer layer, silence fell over the group. Inside, beneath ruined oilcloth and mold, lay a single object that still held shape. A phone, old, corroded, but unmistakably Daniel's, the very phone that had gone missing the morning he vanished. For Leanne, the sight was both relief and dread. Relief that something of him had finally come back, dread that the storm had not returned a man, only a remnant. She pressed her hand against her mouth, trembling as rain soaked her hair and jacket. 5 years of waiting had ended not with a body, not with answers, but with a device sealed away by the ocean, carrying whatever fragments it still held. As the storm gathered strength, officers packed the duffel into evidence bags and escorted Leanne back to her car. She kept looking over her shoulder at the cliffs, at the spot where the sea had finally given something back. For 5 years, Breakers Point had held silence. Now, in the teeth of the worst storm in a decade, it had chosen to speak, and no one knew yet what the message would be. The nor'easter tore through the Maine coast like a living thing, clawing at homes, flooding harbors, and snapping boats from their moorings. For nearly 30 hours, the storm hammered Penobscot Bay, shutting down power grids and forcing families to huddle by candlelight. When it finally passed, the silence it left behind was almost worse than the roar. The air carried that raw, metallic smell that only comes after seawater has flooded streets and seeped into basements. Roads were blocked by fallen trees. Entire stretches of shoreline looked rearranged, as if the storm had reshaped the land itself. Emergency crews spent days combing the beaches, clearing wreckage, and documenting losses for insurance. Furniture, lumber, lobster traps, even whole sheds were scattered like toys along the rocks. But in Breakers Point, the destruction gave up something else. Wedged deep in a cluster of boulders, tangled in kelp and driftwood, lay a bundle wrapped in blackened oilcloth. From the road above, it looked like just another piece of trash. But when volunteers tried to tug it free, they felt the weight inside. The wrapping peeled away to reveal a waterproof duffel, battered but still sealed. The bag was heavier than it should have been for something abandoned at sea. It had the smell of brine and mildew, the outer strap stiff with salt. When officers unzipped the main pocket under the shelter of a canopy, what they found stopped them cold. A cell phone, corroded but intact, cushioned inside plastic. The model matched Daniel Mercer's, the same one that had gone missing 5 years earlier, the same one police and searchers had combed the shoreline for and never recovered. Somehow, against all odds, it had returned. The discovery was treated with care. Officers logged the bag into evidence and shipped it straight to the state crime lab. For days afterward, locals flocked to Breakers Point, drawn by morbid curiosity. The tide that had hidden Daniel for half a decade had finally given something back. The news spread fast. Missing fisherman's phone found after 5 years made headlines in regional outlets, then climbed to national coverage. Reporters descended on the small town once again, filling diners and motel parking lots, pointing cameras at the cliffs that had swallowed a man without sound. Leanne could barely leave her house without being trailed by microphones. She refused most requests, but when she did speak, her voice carried a weight that drew the public in. "This doesn't close anything," she told a station in Portland. "If the sea returned his phone, it means there's more out there. It means he was there, and something happened to him. I want the truth." Her daughter, now 17, kept her distance, but the story reignited her nightmares. She told her mother she was terrified of what they might find on that phone. Detectives reopened the case, though not with the fanfare the media expected. Behind closed doors, investigators acknowledged the phone could be the turning point they needed. If data could be recovered, it might reveal Daniel's final movements, his last contacts, maybe even evidence of someone else present that morning. The challenge was time. 5 years in salt air and moisture could destroy even the toughest hardware. Still, forensic experts believed they had a chance. At the lab, technicians dismantled the phone piece by piece. The corrosion was severe but not catastrophic. The motherboard showed signs of salt exposure, but the memory chip, the heart of its data, remained sealed in resin, remarkably preserved. Engineers placed it under microscopes, drying and cleaning with careful chemical baths. Every move was logged. If they could extract even fragments, photos, texts, GPS data, it might answer questions that had hung over the case for half a decade. Meanwhile, the town buzzed with theories. Some claimed the phone had been planted, that someone kept it hidden all these years and only the storm forced it out. Others argued it had been drifting the whole time, caught in currents, only to be spat back by the violent waves. At the bait shop, fishermen debated whether a waterproof bag could survive that long. Most agreed it could if sealed properly. Which led to another question: who had sealed it? Detectives avoided speculation, but privately they admitted the bag was suspicious. Daniel had never been known to carry waterproof duffels. The oilcloth wrapping suggested deliberate protection, not a rushed accident. If Daniel himself had packed it, why hadn't he taken it home? And if someone else had, what were they hiding? For Leanne, the phone's recovery stirred a complicated grief, hope that answers might come, fear of what truths might surface. She held on to the image of the bag being dragged from the rocks, seaweed clinging to its sides like fingers. She told her sister it felt like Daniel was reaching out across the years, leaving one last message she wasn't sure she wanted to read. As the lab prepared to attempt data extraction, investigators braced themselves. The phone was no longer just an object. It was a time capsule, a frozen moment from the morning Daniel Mercer vanished. And if the ocean had kept it safe all these years, maybe, just maybe, it was because the truth inside was never meant to stay hidden forever. The phone was treated like fragile evidence from a crime scene frozen in time. For weeks, technicians worked on it, carefully drying, cleaning, and isolating the memory chip. There was no guarantee anything could be recovered after 5 years in salt air and storm surges. But against the odds, fragments began to appear. Bits of data stitched together from corrupted sectors, text files, GPS logs, and most importantly, photos. When investigators opened the first images, they braced themselves for disappointment. What they saw instead was both mundane and haunting. The earliest photos dated to September 8, 2018, the morning Daniel disappeared. He had taken several shots of the cliffs and ocean, typical of the way he sometimes documented conditions for his journal. The first few were ordinary. Fog curling across the rocks, the tide receding, the dull light of morning just starting to brighten the sky. Another showed a wide shot of the water stretching to the horizon, empty and gray. On their own, they could have been taken by anyone, but when analysts scrolled further, the ordinary began to fray. At 7:41 a.m., Daniel captured a photo of his bait, squid strips laid neatly on a rock ledge. At 7:42, another shot of the surf foaming at his feet. Then, at 7:43, came the image that froze the room. It was blurry, the kind of photo that comes from raising a phone too quickly. But in the mist, a faint silhouette emerged, a human figure walking toward him. The form was pale against the fog, its outline hazy but unmistakably upright. Investigators leaned in, adjusting filters, sharpening contrast. With every adjustment, the shape grew clearer. The figure was distant, half-shrouded, but appeared to be carrying something long. At first, analysts assumed it was another fishing rod, but when the image was magnified, the angle seemed wrong. The object wasn't tilted like a rod prepared for casting. It was gripped tight, parallel to the ground. Some swore it looked like a rifle. Others argued it could still be fishing gear, warped by fog and distance. But whatever it was, Daniel had lifted his phone to capture it, and 40 minutes later, he was gone. The timestamp made the photo more chilling. At 7:43 a.m., Daniel was alive, standing on those rocks, aware enough of what he saw to document it. After that, no further images existed, no texts, no calls. The device shut down minutes later, either by water damage or by force. Investigators believed it was his last act before vanishing, a silent record of someone else present at Breaker's Point that morning. When Leanne was shown the image, she wept. Not because it confirmed her fears, but because it proved Daniel hadn't been alone. For years she had been told he likely slipped, fell, or wandered. Now, staring at the shadow of a stranger walking toward him, she knew those explanations were lies. She asked detectives over and over, "Who is that? Do you know who that is?" But the truth was, no one did. The photo was released to the public in a controlled briefing, though blurred enough to avoid misidentifications. Predictably, it set the town ablaze. Some claimed they recognized the posture, insisting it looked like one of the men from Daniel's old fishing crew. Others thought it could have been Mason, the estranged brother who had returned weeks after the disappearance. Online forums speculated endlessly, some convinced it was just pareidolia, an illusion of fog mistaken for a person. But detectives dismissed that. The figure was too defined, the proportions too exact. Daniel had photographed someone real. Within the department, the debate over the long object became an obsession. Analysts enhanced the image repeatedly, but clarity only went so far. One investigator argued it matched the profile of a bolt-action hunting rifle common in Maine. Another said the taper at the end looked more like a rod handle. Without sharper pixels, the distinction was impossible. The ambiguity itself made the image more sinister. Because if it was a rifle, then Daniel's disappearance was no accident. The release of the image also breathed new life into the media storm. National outlets revisited the case, replaying old interviews with Leanne, digging into Mason's history, even staking out the homes of Daniel's former co-workers. Strangers sent in tips claiming they knew the man in the photo, each lead collapsing under scrutiny. The case file swelled, but no name ever stuck. For investigators, the photo marked a turning point. Until then, the Mercer case could be written off as a tragic but ordinary accident. With the figure in the fog, it shifted into something else entirely. There was now visual proof that someone else had been there that morning, close enough for Daniel to notice, close enough for him to raise his phone, and possibly close enough to silence him. What haunted detectives most was the expression they imagined in Daniel's final act. He hadn't shouted, hadn't called anyone. He had simply lifted the phone and taken a picture, as if he knew something wasn't right, as if he knew this would be his only witness. And then, just like the fog rolling in, he was gone. The photo from Daniel's phone had shifted the case, but it was the fingerprint from his journal that brought investigators back to Mason. For years, that smudged partial print had sat in storage, unattached to any identity. It was the only tangible sign that someone else had touched Daniel's most private possession. Now, with expanded fingerprint databases that included familial connections, the lab reran the sample. This time, it didn't come back empty. The print was a familial match, not to Daniel, but to his younger brother, Mason Mercer. The news struck like a lightning bolt inside the department. Mason had been vocal from the start, insisting Daniel had enemies, pointing fingers at the fishing crew, fueling rumors that someone else was responsible. But now, the evidence suggested Mason himself had been closer to Daniel's final days than he admitted. Investigators confronted him directly, presenting the lab results. Mason didn't flinch. He admitted the print was his, but brushed it off casually. He claimed he had borrowed the journal months before Daniel's disappearance, flipping through it for tide data when he'd briefly returned to town that summer. If the print remained, it was nothing more than a relic of that visit. At first glance, his story could have explained it, but detectives weren't satisfied. They pressed for details, dates, times, why he would need Daniel's journal when the brothers had barely spoken in years. That's when cracks began to show. Mason contradicted himself, first saying he'd returned in June, then later claiming it was August. He couldn't remember where he stayed. offering vague mentions of a buddy's couch. His timeline shifted with every interview. Investigators dug deeper. They pulled Mason's phone records, his financial transactions, even questioned people who might have seen him that summer. What emerged was troubling. A gas station clerk remembered Mason passing through in early September, just days before Daniel vanished. A neighbor claimed they saw him near Daniel's house late at night, though the memory was hazy. None of it was proof, but it chipped away at the image Mason tried to present, a distant brother, uninvolved in the tragedy. The pressure mounted until a judge approved a limited search warrant for Mason's property. Officers combed through his small rental on the edge of town, focusing on the shed in his backyard. It was cluttered with tools, spare parts, and old furniture, the kind of place no one paid much attention to. But in the far corner, buried beneath stacks of rotting lumber, they unearthed something that didn't fit. A sealed plastic container, its lid wrapped tightly in duct tape. Inside were 3 items that froze the room. The first was a rag, stiff with dried stains that later tested positive for blood. The second was a folding pocket knife engraved with Daniel's initials, the very one he had carried since his 20s, often clipped to his belt when he went fishing. And the third was a photograph, faded with age, showing the 2 brothers as children standing side by side near the bay. Across the bottom, scrawled in ink, were 5 chilling words. Only one Mercer survives. When confronted with the discovery, Mason's reaction only deepened suspicion. He laughed at first, calling it a setup, insisting someone had planted the container to frame him. He said the knife could have been stolen, the rag explained away, the photo altered, but none of his explanations carried weight. Why would anyone go to such lengths, burying evidence in his own shed? Why hold on to a blood-stained rag if he had nothing to hide? Detectives debated whether the container was enough to make an arrest. The blood was degraded, too old to confirm conclusively as Daniel's. The knife, while damning, carried no fresh fingerprints. And the photo, disturbing as it was, proved only sentiment, not crime. The DA hesitated, worried the case was still too circumstantial. Mason's lawyer moved quickly, calling the items meaningless relics twisted into a narrative by desperate investigators. But in the court of public opinion, Mason was already condemned. The town whispered his name in grocery aisles and bars, convinced the wrong brother had been standing at Breaker's Point that morning. Leanne cut off contact entirely, telling reporters she no longer believed Mason's concern had ever been genuine. Their daughter refused to see him again. Yet despite the evidence, no charges were filed. The case stalled once more, leaving everyone trapped in the same cycle of suspicion and silence. Mason walked free, but his reputation was shattered. And for investigators, the question only deepened. If Mason was responsible, why keep the phone hidden in a sealed bag for years, only for the storm to uncover it? And if he wasn't, then who was the figure Daniel captured in the fog? And why did Mason have a box buried in his shed that whispered of blood and survival? In the end, it all came down to absence. Investigators had a fingerprint on Daniel's journal, a box buried in Mason's shed, a blood-stained rag, a knife with Daniel's initials, and a photograph scrawled with words that sounded like a threat. They had a phone recovered from the sea after 5 years, and inside it, a single haunting image, a figure in the fog walking toward Daniel on the morning he vanished. It was more than most missing persons cases ever produced. And yet, when the district attorney reviewed the file, the answer was the same. No charges. Without a body, without direct proof tying Mason or anyone else to Daniel's disappearance, the case wasn't strong enough to survive in court. Mason walked out of the station with his lawyer at his side, shoulders squared as if daring the world to look at him differently. And they did. Half the town already believed he was guilty, convinced the evidence, however circumstantial, told the story clearly. They said he came back that September not to mourn his brother, but to finish old business. They pointed to the inconsistencies in his alibi, the anger that colored his past, the strange obsession with shifting blame onto Daniel's old fishing crew. To them, it was obvious. Mason had taken his brother's life, but the other half wasn't so sure. They pointed to the photo from Daniel's phone, the blurred silhouette emerging through the fog. The figure's posture, its build, even the angle of the shoulders, it didn't quite match Mason. Some argued it was too tall, others said too lean. No amount of enhancement could bring the pixels into certainty, but to those who studied it, the man in the mist was someone else entirely. If that was true, then who had Daniel captured in his final seconds? And why did Mason still have items tied to his brother buried in a container? The debate tore the community apart. At the diner, conversations ended in silence when strangers walked in, because no one could be sure where their loyalties fell. In the bait shops, fishermen muttered about the sea keeping secrets, that Daniel had crossed paths with someone out there no one wanted to name. Teenagers dared each other to walk Breaker's Point at night, whispering about the lights seen in the fog, the screams some swore they heard years earlier. The place had become legend now, cursed ground, where the ocean didn't just take but chose. For Leanne, the decision not to prosecute was another wound. She had lived through half a decade of waiting, only to watch the system hesitate at the edge of justice. She told reporters she didn't know if Mason was guilty. What she knew was that someone had stood on those rocks with Daniel, someone who had walked toward him while the fog thickened. That was proof enough that this was no accident. But without a body, without a confession, all she could do was go back to the cliffs each year, staring at the water, waiting for the sea to give up more than a phone. Investigators quietly admitted their frustration. There were certain pieces of the truth sat in their files, but none fit tightly enough to lock into place. They revisited Daniel's old fishing crew, but the leads dried up. They pushed again at Mason, but the lawyer blocked every angle. They revisited the journal, the photograph in the container, the image on the phone. None of it crossed the line from suspicion to proof. The case remained active, but stagnant, an open file that haunted every detective who touched it. In time, the Mercer case became one of those stories families told in fragments, depending on which side of the argument they believed. Some children grew up hearing Mason was a murderer who had walked free because the ocean erased his crime. Others were raised to believe the sea itself was responsible, that Daniel had been pulled into something darker offshore, something no court or DA could explain. For outsiders, it was just another unsolved file. For the town, it was a fracture that never healed. 5 years had passed before the sea gave up a phone. Another 5 might pass before it offered anything else, or maybe it never would. For now, the cliffs of Breaker's Point stood the same as they always had, jagged, wind-cut, and silent. Tourists sometimes stopped at the overlook, unaware of the story, while locals kept their distance. They said the water there felt different, heavier, as if it remembered, and always, in the center of the mystery, lingered that blurred photo. Daniel's last act before he vanished was to raise his phone and capture someone in the fog. A man walking toward him, carrying something long. Some said rod, others said rifle. But everyone agreed on one thing. That figure was the closest thing to an answer they had. And until the day the sea decided to release more than silence, that shadow would remain the only witness to what happened on the morning Daniel Mercer disappeared.